Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we're here with Dario Nardi and we're going to discuss the ISFJ subtypes, starting with the dominant subtype.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. And this is coming off of ISTJ in our last look-see. ISTJ was a type that I know a lot about from immediate and intermediate family members. ISFJ, I just mostly know from acquaintances and clients. So it's a little bit different experience nonetheless, and some coworkers over the years. Nonetheless, there is a lot to say about this type that is a lot more interesting than I think the stereotype is. Maybe even more than ISTJ. ISFJ gets this very sort of one-dimensional, like protective supporter, caring, like has cutesy little things in their home, is very quiet, sensitive, likes everything, like very neat and orderly. That's when we go by the preferences, we get that. But I really think the subtypes is like one of those that can sort of break open ISFJ and show the variety that's there. ISTJ and ISFJ are both types that when they are that type and they do like MBTI or whatever, I think that they often come out as their type. But ISFJ is also, and I really saw this in the subtypes, one that can come out as ESFJ or INFJ. I think there's a lot of people who type as INFJ who are actually ISFJ. Nothing wrong with that, just saying, the creative subtype. And then the dominant subtype is, again, going to be look a little bit different. And the person might even type is like a thinking type or something. So I am pretty enthusiastic to talk about these three because only one of them I feel really matches the normalizing, matches the ISFJ that we know from like the basic type descriptions. So group mediator is what I call it. And again, I made up these names. They aren't scientific names. They're just based on, I feel like, what conveys in a few words what's going on. This ISFJ is more driven, more assertive, more confident, than ambitious than other ISFJs. And I feel like something, when we say group mediator, there's an element of shepherding. And like all of the folks in a dominant position, they're either in a leadership position or they're moving into one. They're sort of naturally drawn to that. And people notice like, oh yeah, you'd be good in a leadership position. Or they're comfortable approaching leaders and talking to them. I feel like probably ISFJ, because it is a more sort of low-key, behind-the-scenes sensitive type, is going to be obviously not as ambitious as, say, a dominant ESTJ or a dominant ENTP or something, but still relative to the other ISFJs. There's this element of shepherding people within the organization, like being aware with the mediator that there's the group, whatever that is, the family unit, the community, the company, their department or team. There are other groups around that. And their idea of leadership is not standing on a hill and, waving their staff or rod or whatever in the air with the crown. It's going to be more of this quiet mediator kind of role. That dominant though they may be, they're still going to spend time in their office. And what I feel too is also the leadership shows up in a very humanistic element. And very concerned, like, how can I give back and help others give back to society? What role can I play that meets people's human needs as they view them? So there's like this extroverted feeling, energy to it. That's what's of value to society and how to. Like when we get to ESFJ, we'll talk about this. That the ESFJ has this awareness, like, people need to know about good health and they need to know like how to navigate through the medical system, complicated as it is. So like, let's set up an organization, a charity, like educational thing to like help people navigate that. I think in the case of ISFJ, it's a little bit more, it's less entrepreneurial and more institutional. So an example would be ISFJ school principal. I think that's like there was one in the study. So that's like a great example, I felt, of that. Like the others, who are dominant, that there's this brain-wise, there's a bias towards the front of the brain. But what I notice with these ISFJs, dominant ones, is still they have all of the other qualities of the other ones. Like I found looking at all of the 4 subtypes that they're not just like, oh yeah, I'm like only wiring in the front of the brain, which could be ENFJ or something like that. No, they got a nice halo of things going on. They have like different skills, like a body awareness and the visual and auditory awareness. They got a little bit of like a hidden starburst, like the dominant ISTJ, for like those little moments of like quirkiness, which I think for them is more about not quirky jokes, but like entertaining questions. Because remember, their opposite type is ENTP. So they can get in this mode. It's like, yeah, well, what are good questions to ask and to answer for us to get clarity on, say, decisions we're going to make or whatever it is. And I found that, yeah, they do, like the other dominant ones, have like these good managerial skills. And I really mean this. This is something that shows up in the brain. There's then a confidence that goes with it in terms of decision making, as long as it's fairly familiar stuff. So they're never going to be like so pushy. And in general, ISFJ, I mean, we'll talk about this at the end, has a sort of theme of being passive aggressive at times. I think all the behind the scenes types can be like that. But there definitely is this ability to address stuff and to speak to it and say like, hey, we need to do something. And there may even be a little bit of dramatic flair that goes with it. I think that they really want people to get along. Like that's very important for them. And then the sensing side of them and the thinking side are like following the protocols, like what are we preserving here? How do we keep it going forward? What are the expected ways of doing things? This ISFJ, well, in particular, they may not be a tool user, but tools in the sense of like software tools today, like, project management tools. Because generally speaking, like the FJ types, they want things to be organized, but they don't have the TJ skill to just like keep everything organized in their head all the time for optimal, not just efficiency, but effectiveness. So they're like, well, let's have like a project management tool and this tool and that tool. And, they're going to be using those or direct others to use those. And we'll say that's true of the normalizing one a lot too. What I saw in the data, and it was about 50-50 between those who are more like analytic side of the brain and those who are more like holistic, artistic side, very much involved with things like charity organizations, human resources, medicine, like working at a medical center, schools, being part of some kind of professional network. So it's funny, that's where they have something in common with the INTP, because like INTPs will get together remotely and they all have this interest in like computer programming or biology or whatever it is. ISFJs are also like, oh, like what is our community of, and they have this like introverted thinking element to them. It's like, what is our network of technical expertise? And let me be the person that like brings people together and helps them talk and sets like norms and standards for how we're going to interact with each other. And I would say in general, if we had to capture dominant, it would be like the very patient or mostly patient. I mean, they have limits too. Yet sort of like tough love kind of mom or dad, but for their group, their company, their team, whatever it is. And then their drive is to minimize conflict and to maximize harmony. And of course, they're still introverts, so they still like that sort of quiet time to review at the end of the day and learn and soak up stuff. But that's a little bit more of a side thing. Yeah, so that's, I would say in a nutshell, that wasn't a nutshell, but that's a lot of different stuff. That sort of what an ISFJ look like as a leader.
Yeah. And so I could see the dominant ISFJ seeming like an ESFJ at times in terms of their ability to use extroverted feeling. It's going to be very pronounced in them,
Mhm.
yet they will actually be an ISFJ if you get to know them. And
Yeah.
so with the dominant persona, when you think of ISFJ, sometimes you'll have the image of someone who's very docile, whereas for the dominant, they might have a very overt, like a stronger personality than you'd expect from a
Mhm.
behind the scenes type. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
feel like what helps an ISFJ succeed at the dominant subtype or that life path or like exploring that is that they can be in a leadership position that is around something. Of course, they have some care and there's a human element to it, sure. But there's like a long-term stability to it, like hospitals or the school system or something like that. Whereas ESFJ is going to have a more entrepreneurial spirit to them and be like, oh, yeah, what is going on here? And let me join with a group of people and like, let's figure out how we're going to do this, especially as technology becomes more common. So I think if they can have the time to learn how to be a leader, to see role models and examples and sort of explore how to do that in an institution or something stable, then they really can then that's where they can really succeed at it.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And so that brings us to the creative ISFJ. Dario calls this the artistic composer. When we think of ISFJ, we oftentimes neglect the more artistic ISFJs. And so an ISFJ who is more artistic might struggle with finding out their type at times,
Hmm.
because I could see how they could look like an INFJ at times.
Hmm.
Because even 16 personalities has the question, are you artistic or do you like art museums, as a question they use to differentiate sensing and intuition. And it's like, I don't know if that's a thing that they should be doing, because creative subtype ISFJs would totally test out as INFJ there. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, so many, and this was true of INFJ as well, the creative subtype. And you ask them about hobbies or even what they do is their career, music. Maybe not just music. It could be music videos. It could be art also. But there always is this passion and interest in music. They're very auditory type and subtype. Um, and just being artistically inclined and yeah, very easily appearing like either they're INFJ or because of the music subculture and just sort of in general that sort of more flowy exploratory approach because they are more exploratory and more social, um, social for fun, not social for dominance, compared to other ISFJs. They can even look ISFP like at first. Um, the difference is when you apply a little bit of pressure, all of a sudden the ISFJ becomes quite, uh, uh, what is this? And wanting things to be sort of set. Where the ISFP is like all of life is an adventure, and like whatever comes up each day is like whatever. But that's what we're meeting each day. Um, so yeah, so this version is if dominant feels sort of testosterone driven, then this subtype feels dopamine driven, and I think combined with their artistic interests or their auditory skills, that it ends up a lot of times in music, but it doesn't have to be. I just think in general, as long as they feel reasonably secure, um, like an ISFP could live couch surfing and be a musician. ISFJ is going to feel like, no, I need to settle somewhere, anywhere, and have something that is set like a framework because they are an IJ type in order to then be feeling secure enough that yeah, each day to day I can be like working on my music and get into this like artistic flow. And I had a tenant for several years, ISFJ preferences. I mean, he learned just enough about type, and it was he himself was clear on ISFJ, but music composer. And when I would talk to him about his process and the creative process, a lot of elements at first are like, wow, that's like my creative process because I'm also creative subtype. So in theory, we both understand each other's lifestyle very well. That said, when it got to some of the details, like how he would compose music, is he knows so well all of the different like styles and genres and the ways you put each of them together, and he loves John Williams and Star Wars, and like understands like every note and transition and like all of these things for that. And when he got his results from brain imaging, and it's like this starburst pattern, and he's like, oh, this makes total sense to me. He's like, absolutely, because I need to draw upon my whole storehouse of like, he literally used the word storehouse of knowledge and experience in order to create something. Whereas for INTJ or INFJ, it's more like, yeah, just some like extra dimensional muse is going to come down and like strike lightning, and somehow we're going to create something that other people are like, what did you take? Like, just like they're confused because maybe I read about an article on the internet once, and then all of a sudden create something, and they're like, this looks like it came from an expert. And it's like, no, just like a muse, like completely struck me, and like a doorway opened into the Akashic records or whatever. And so there is very much still, even though there's the starburst pattern, which defines that like all the brain regions getting active all at once, it's drawing upon their senses and their memory and everything that they know. And I think even with introverted thinking, because introverted thinking is often like a core like technique, like a principle. And so you have to like swirl everything around that you know and find like a best fit in order to meet that principle. For this situation or this project or whatever it is. I think like a great example is jazz. So ISFJ came in, different ISFJ. He's a musician on the side. That says like his night job. He plays jazz music in a band. And what was so interesting is he came up and he really wanted to know about like how he gets into flow when he does music. And when he just played some music, like he brought some stuff with him and whatever. And when he just played music by himself, like, I'm like, no, like you didn't get into flow with that. Like just looking at the brain activity. And he's like, wait. He's like, okay, I have an idea. I asked him like, when do you think you get best into flow? So we did a little Q&A, and then he came up with this idea that he was going to use his phone. And on his phone, he has a recording of his bandmates playing. And then, so he just pressed play on that recording, and he started to listen, and then he started to play, like improvising as he would go and like working into it. As an INTJ, like I absolutely cannot do that. I'm terrible with like weaving in with the group. No, like my whole shtick is like doing something different than the group. But he was so good, and it really was like he got into flow. Like the brain imaging right there on the screen like showed him like getting into this nice flow state. And as he was just imagining his bandmates, and then when we took apart his process and I showed him his results, it's so like, it was so clear from the brain imaging results, he had this whole process, like something that he had like a specialization, which I think like introverted sensing specializes very easily, all of them, regardless of subtype. And he would listen, and he would also look at his bandmates' facial expressions, because he said that was one thing. He's like, as he was listening to their music, he's imagining what their facial expressions are as they look at each other. And then it goes to a different part of his brain. So it goes from here over to here, and there was a very strong connection, which is actually this region that handles many variables at once. And he's like, yeah, I completely do that, because I'm taking this information from the band, and I have to find very quickly, like, what is the next thing to do that's the best fit? And then from there, he has to actually, then it goes from there over to here, like controlling his like right hand and all of that, because he's like, then I need to execute stuff. Like I need to execute the chords that I'm doing that, and I know those. Like, he's like, my fingers just know what to do, but it's like this very clear loop that's there. So it's still a type that's very grounded, and its creativity is one that is more like a little bit more like band or group oriented, and one that builds off of a lot of experience as opposed to innovation or novelty. And like he's very, very good at creating music that reminds you of John Williams without it being John Williams. And, specifically, like, he just knows, and I just found that so fascinating. Yeah, I would say that's, and in my experience, very much unlike dominant or normalizing, that the creative ones, like, they have a network that they're involved in, but they do tend to be solo experts. In the sense, like, they may like play with some people and have a little band and stuff, but they're not like part of some big institution or something like that, because they're still rebels in a way. They still want to do their own thing, even if they're not quite clear, but they like fancy, oh yeah, there's this project I want to do. And they go do that. And then a little bit that looks like a little bit of maybe selfish, introverted feeling that comes in there. I don't know. But there is this, like, being the expert, and people are approaching me, and then I have this project and I knew who to call to like help me out with this, and they know I'm really good. And they are really good at delivering stuff that's creative, that also meets the norm of the population, like what people are familiar with. People love John Williams, so let's make something that's like John Williams, but like a little bit different. And so it's not like they present people with like, oh my God, this is so experimental. Like, what is this? No, that's not how they work. I guess some other things I would mention. They stayed like, the socializing and like variety in their life. But they also still like, as all ISFJs, their circle of friends, their close circle of friends. They need a space that is very much like their creative cave. And they will absolutely avoid people, I think, even be frightened of people that might disrupt their process or bring negativity that then distracts them from their creativity. So like all ISFJs, they still have the sensitivity to them. They just are more focused on the act of creativity itself.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. You mentioned the SITI of the ISFJ in this. You mentioned how they call upon their entire storehouse of experiences and knowledge to find the principle to convey in an artistic manner. And so it's interesting to see the functions at work in certain subtypes. And so, how do you differentiate from ISFJ and INFJ in this case if they're a creative ISFJ?
Very good question. So thinking to the INFJ creative subtypes that I've had, I think that what it is, it's not that the creative INFJs are super innovative, because they tend to like sing or perform or convey things that are still familiar topics to people about love and loss, and like a social interactions and emotions and the purpose of life and all of that. So there is a little bit more like philosophical element, I think. Certainly the INFJ is a lot more metaphorical, like in their lyrics, for example. But in the actual act of playing music, even if they're technically skilled, I have observed that they have much more like, I know this isn't how people normally do music, but this is how I do music. That they have their own way, that the INFJ's inner ISTP is like, yeah, I do my own thing. Like, I know I'm supposed to play a keyboard this way, and I did take some lessons when I was young, but they're not going to memorize all of these things. They don't have a storehouse of like 5,000 songs. INFJ is much more, this is my creative process. I call upon my muses. I find the right space. I have my own way of making the music with a favorite, instruments, a way of doing it. And then there is, even though INFJ and ISFJ are both perfectionistic, INFJ has this vision of how it's going to be. And they're going to do that even if that means when the song is recorded and they have bandmates and stuff, they're going to play every instrument and do everything themselves and make it absolutely perfect in this, like, a sort of, it's like it comes down to like, I'm the only one who can make this particular vision happen. Whereas ISFJ is more, I've composed, like, they have that huge database of knowledge and technique, and they have a strong sense of role. And they're like, my role is to compose, and it's the role of the symphony or the bandmates or whatever to perform. And I might go there and see them do it, and that's like fun, but I'm going to trust them to do that in their role. Or maybe not trust them and then pick somebody else to work with. So I think ISFJ is a little bit more communal, and INFJ is a little bit more, I'm going to do it all myself and definitely do it in my own way. And then that storehouse of technique and knowledge is just so much more detailed with ISFJ, like shockingly detailed.
Yeah, so detail is a way that you could tell apart these two types. And another way too, possibly, is where they feel obligated. As we talked about in the ISTJ episode, SJ types are known for having a communal, concrete obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And while INFJs may have certain obligations in the world that they do have, I feel like INFJs have a sense of obligation to self actualize that they can't really get rid of. And they have a need to actualize their calling. And it's more of this amorphous sense that's always there that causes the restlessness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
It's
so,
almost like the obligation is to the universe, not to like, the very specific people in their lives. I mean, there is that too, but like, where is it in the hierarchy of values? Yeah, I don't think the ISFJ, as philosophical as they can get sometimes, and they do enjoy like talking about philosophy or whatever, is going to proceed feeling that like, yeah, I'm self-actualizing in the cosmos.
yeah, well put. It's the NFs wanting to self-actualize in the
Yes.
cosmos.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny is I know it sounds corny, but like in the really, really big picture, I mean, it's in a way almost, I'm not saying the only answer that makes sense, because there are the practical things to pay attention right in front of you, the service that one can give to the people immediately in their lives. But if we get lost in that and forget that we're just like floating blobs of consciousness in a cosmos of energy, if we forget about that, then it's like, well, why are we doing what we're doing? We're just robots. And so it's, yeah, for INFJ, it's not even I'm trying to better myself. There is this orientation to the sort of like the infinite and universal purpose, or however we might say it.
Yeah, so true. And so that brings us to the normalizing version of the ISFJ. Dario calls this the conscientious supporter. This subtype of ISFJ is correlated with the hormone of serotonin,
Mhm.
and I'll let Dario take it away.
Sure. Yeah. So this, I want to say that this is the most stereotypical ISFJ. That's not quite true, because they can also look sort of ISTJ like at times. Just because there is this like chart the course, what are the rules kind of thing. But yeah, looking at the way the brain is organized and what that supports, and what they report demographically, education, and all of that, we see a type that's like very conventional and specialized. And in today's world, with technology, like not just the internet and computers, but AI and like these kinds of things, that this ISFJ does bring in also the thinking element, in terms of like tinkering and being familiar with the tools that support their professional practice, all of that. So they're like very careful, conservative, like responsible, caring too. Um, and I think this is a good moment to mention, um, all of the, or both SFJs can be portrayed at times as like, oh, they're very caring and supporting of their community, and like they're a little bit of pushovers and that kind of thing. Well, I've met ISFJs also that come from a different social class, um, and they may have also, or they've risen to a point of, based upon their title and their role in the organization. Like they've really been honored, and they've been there 30 years and this and that. And their extroverted feeling is not a pushover. It's not being like, oh, I'm just going to help you because, like, they also have a sense of entitlement. And I mean that in the most general way, that like, I've earned my place to be here. and this is what I'm doing, and this is what you need to do, and you like just started. So like, what are you doing? And I just want to mention that that is an element of ISFJ, that there is like, they're very aware of role appropriate behavior. And sometimes their role is like the higher role. And they're very clear that like, no, you need to do this for me. Like, why aren't you doing that? Aren't you aware of that? So just saying, like, I just wanted to mention that because I do think that that comes into play with normalizing a bit, that they are very conscientious and very focused on their roles. But this is a part of it. Like once they mature into that role, they're also sort of like trying to help others fulfill their roles. So what we see in the brain is this even field pattern, probably among, this is true for all of the normalizing folks, regardless of type. We tend to see like some kind of even field pattern, or maybe there's like a more analytic left bias or back bias that folds into that. If anything, by the way, for ISFJ, they have this even field and it's very clear, but they can also have a right brain bias instead of left brain. So they still have like this sort of artistic, humanistic sense, even though they're, very like one step at a time. Go from A to B to C to D. This is why a meeting with this person can last like 3 hours, because they're like, well, we need to walk through every point and sub points. And they, not because they have a passion for sub points, but because they feel obligated to do that. And there's a lot of SI detail management, and that's how it comes out, is a lot of like detail management. Reasoning skills, the TI tends to come out. It can be tool use, like a nurse, for example, using the equipment. And it can also be language-based reasoning, which is that just sort of walking through something mentally step by step. The kind of thing that's like, if all dogs are animals and all animals, or all dogs are, animals and many animals are pets, and about pets, they should be treated like people, and therefore arrive at like a principle about animal rights. That they're very much, you have to walk them through those steps of reasoning. Otherwise, they're like, that doesn't really hang together. But I would say for the most part, their thinking is very much focused on practicalities of whatever it is that they're doing day to day. Like, what do we need to do today? Who's doing it? I think it can be frustrating because this type fits into TJ organizations and they're not TJ types. So effectiveness is not, to quote Personality Hacker, where TE is extrovert thinking is about effectiveness. They're actually not, they may think they're focused on effectiveness, but their idea of effective is we tick off the boxes and people are happy going through the process, or like satisfied, not even happy, but they're satisfied. There's harmony around it. And then an ENTJ or something comes in and is like, but this isn't working at all. Like, why are you wasting so many resources going step by step? So it is, there is this conflict between this type being the supporter and conscientious and fitting into TJ organizations. So I think it's more satisfying if they go into something that has more FJ, like extroverted feeling built into it. So like a charity, as opposed to just being an accountant in a cubicle, or at least it's accounting about a charity. Fine arts, like managing an art collection. I mean, that's something you do in a museum. Like you're looking through all those things. It requires technical knowledge. Library science, passion of reading, people coming in and going out of the library. And many libraries today have many community-oriented things. They teach crafts and have speakers and psychology. But that psychology is not like one-on-one relationship building and delving into the deep psychology. It's more like career counselor. And like, we're going to give you this assessment because this is what we do. Like say the strong interest inventory. And then based on these results, these are the careers that are available to it. In fact, I do remember an experience as an undergrad going to the career center. I don't know what type the gal was. It was a long time ago, but she was following their process, which was a very like standardized process. And I took the strong interest inventory, and you get results like your top 3 out of 6 categories. And then you look in a giant book, and that book reports like what are typical careers for that category. And I happened to score the one combination of top 3 that had no careers listed under it. And she literally didn't know what to do. Like, I mean, there's only so many combinations. Yes, there are 6, and they can come in any order, and like, what is the top 3? But she was like, she had no idea what to do. And because like the book it was empty. It like had a little header, and then it was like, oh, no careers listed for this. I'm like, statistically significantly. Obviously, people of that pattern have careers, but nothing statistically significant. And I'm like, I don't know, like something is definitely missing in your process if you just like the car suddenly stops and you don't know where to go. So I think that if they're in an environment where they get support and the process is more like concrete, but also handles enough so that they know how to step outside the box, because they're not the creative subtype. They are normalizing, and it's very step by step, and A to B to whatever it is it's going to go there. Secretarial work, like as long as it's, oh, you need to write a business letter, what is the appropriate language to use with this kind of customer? Boom, like perfect. Oh, but we have this other weird customer, and then a problem developed. We've never encountered this problem. And like, what do we do? So this is where they obviously benefit from their giant storehouse of experiences, and where they benefit from type development, that introverted thinking to give them principles to fall back on to inform what to do in the weird moments. I feel like one more thing to say is the capacity. So one of my friends from college, I went to stay with him in New York once, Long Island, and after spending some time with his family and his mom, I'm like, oh, his mom is definitely an ISFJ. And there's a little plaque that's there that's like home sweet home. And I kept, what so struck me about the house is like, this is so much like a house for a family. Like this mother cares. Like this mother has like a sense of like home is where the heart is. Home is like the place where family is together, where everything is like safe and comfortable and good and not dangerous or questioning. And it was just like this, I'm like, wow, I never lived in like a house like this before. And I'm not saying it was really fancy or expensive. It was just a home, like a home. And that was just like really, you know, I mean, it was lovely to witness that. And like, what a beautiful thing. So their capacity, because it's the same with the normalizing ISTJ. The normalizing ISTJ has this awareness of all their roles with the community, with the work, with the team, with the, you know, like their church or temple or whatnot. The same for this ISFJ. What are all of their roles? Their roles, of course, a lot of time include their friends and family members, and like what are the relationships between them in the history, and all of that devotion and remembering all of the details, the likes and dislikes. This is something that still gets me, is that sensing feeling types in general remember so well, like the pet peeves and like the little issues and sensitivities and like the trigger and button, you know, like the push button points and everything of every person that they get to meet. For me, I'm like, okay, that's sort of interesting to see, but like, you want to get over that, right? They don't see that as something to get over. That's something to, I mean, you know, not ruin your life over, but like also the pet peeves and like the irritation points in the past experiences, those are what make you, and they're to be treasured. They may not like some of those things in other people, but they're aware of that. And then finally, like ISTJ as well, ISFJ does have this quirky, humorous side. And of course, I think we can't escape it if we think of Marge Simpson from The Simpsons, like really classic normalizing ISFJ. And, I can hear her laugh in my head right now. And for the life of me, I can't actually state at the moment what makes her laugh. Like when they're writing it, how do they know that's when she's going to laugh? Like she finds it funny. I have no idea. But it's some kind of like SINE thing that is there. That's like this little bit of this like quirky amusement, things that make life lighter.
Yeah, I could totally see that. So, normalizing ISFJ is classic ISFJ, and sometimes it can look like even ISTJ at times too. I've had some ISFJs on my panels have that moment of they're very like border on ISTJ, ISFJ in how they test out or their own self perception at times, but they resonate a lot with ISFJ. And
Mhm.
so, how would you tell apart ISTJ and ISFJ in the normalizing category?
Oh, you know what? I think the wonderful thing is I feel like that's really easy to discern. ISTJ, when you ask them how they feel, besides like a very like, I'm going to say like a gross and broad emotion, like angry or sad or something like that, they actually can't say. And if you ask them why they feel that way, that's even harder. For ISFJ, they may be hesitant, in fact, quite hesitant to state an emotion that they feel is going to, oh, by stating this, am I imposing on the other person to like help me or something? But they are very aware of what they feel. Maybe they're not aware of like what to do about that feeling, like internally for themselves. Like maybe they're depressed for quite a while and they know that like they're not happy in their life situation. Maybe they don't have like the gumption or whatever to make a big change because they feel a lot of obligations. But when you ask them how they feel, and more importantly, when you ask them how other people feel, how does Joe feel? How does Maria feel? Oh, they like no question they know these. They may not know why they feel that way. Like, oh yeah, like my teenage son, like he's so angry. And she says, when this happens and like this, and they see the expression on his face and like they know it, like completely unpacking it, they know it. Why may elude them or what to do about it, but they are very aware of it. ISTJ is just like, well, my teenage son is not behaving. And when you scratch the surface even more, like they may have an idea of, oh, this is what we should do to fix it. It may even be the wrong solution because they want to be like effective, but they're just not in touch with their feelings even remotely, like to actually name them and to name other people's emotions like ISFJ is.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. And I'm also wondering because ISTJs have TE parent that they also naturally see the most efficient way of doing something, whereas an ISFJ might take a more roundabout way of being efficient. Well, eventually getting there because their SI will internalize it. They do have a different path there too.
Yeah. That reminds me of I don't know where I read this. It was something that was like the New Yorker, but not like an online magazine. And this person is describing like the culture that's in charitable organizations in America today. And it sounded so much like an ISFJ culture that she's describing. She wasn't, clearly from her comments, she wasn't an ISFJ. Whatever type she was, I don't know. But she's like, how do they spend their time? Like, what are they doing every day? And she discovered, she's like, a lot of people in the office, what they do is, she's like, the charity is, I mean, she had some uncharitable things to say about it, but in general, she said a lot of their time is spent looking for technical tools to document and track the processes that they need to be doing for the charity. And then they spend a lot of the time exploring how to use those and filling in all the details of those all the time and updating them. And then having meetings where they search for consensus and discussion about how to do that properly, or like what is the next upgrade, and like getting everybody ready for the next upgrade in the software, or there's another project coming. Like literally a week spent just trying to organize around like how to get the project into the new tool. And I know, having been in a workplace on a team, like a product development team for a couple of years, but having an ISTJ teammate and an ISFJ intern teammate, and both the ISTJ and I were like, I mean, we understood the purpose of the tracking software because there's a lot going on in the project, but we're like, a lot of time is being wasted. And finally, he said it more charitably than I did. But finally, we're just both like, you know what? The ISTJ would like a document the sort of more high level thing. Oh, like something new has come in. Let me pop that into the tracking. But he doesn't like do the little thing where you expand it and like fill in all the check boxes and stuff. He's like, I just need something to make sure I remember it so that it gets done. And then the ISFJ is literally like at the meetings, like let's expand that Dropbox and like let's like look like each thing that we need to check off. What have we done and not done? And I'm like, oh my God, like literally our entire week would be just doing this. And we were both like, you know what, you can do that, but we're not. I mean, I literally said, I'm going to let you know by an email or verbally what I'm working on and what I finished, and you can update the software if you could. That would be really great. And then I know they get a little bit aggravated by that. Like, why am I not doing that? But to me, is just incredibly ineffective. And even for an ISTJ, it feels like, well, we're not really using our time effectively.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. And so that brings us on to the harmonizing ISFJ.
Mhm.
Dario calls this the gifted conciliator. And so this ISFJ is correlated with the hormones estrogen and oxytocin in Helen Fisher's work.
Mhm. Yeah, more empathic and reflective than other ISFJs. What I found interesting is looking at the data, the brain imaging data, is that there was a fair number of the ISFJs were in the space that was like right between normalizing and harmonizing. So I'm going to describe harmonizing a certain way, wanting folks to remember that a lot of the ISFJs were a blend of harmonizing and normalizing. Like they were in this like, yeah, maybe normalizing first and harmonizing second, because I encourage people to rank them. But so this is a little bit more like what I'm going to say, like the pure harmonizing ISFJ, which is to go like to the functions. If the dominant subtype is a very yang energy, sort of testosterone energy to each of the functions, like the introverted sensing is this very much like a defender of community and values and processes. That the extroverted feeling is very much like a active shepherding as much as they can, to corral people to get like a cohesive harmony. And that the introverted thinking also tends to be something that's very much like, this is the right model or the right principle. And deviations from that, I'm going to correct you, especially with SI and TI together, both like that. They're like, this is the right way to do it and the way we do it. And even if it's legally allowed or we understand your individual situation, you need to follow the principles we have in place for our work, team, organization, whatever. So then harmonizing is the opposite of these. The introverted sensing is very much about the accumulation of the enormous storehouse of sense impressions. And I really want to stress that because there's a lot of misunderstanding about introverted sensing in the type community, both professionally, historically, and online. But we go back to Jung. Jung is actually extremely clear about it. I don't know how people got so far away from Jung on it. But, you know, Jung is saying that anytime that someone like an SJ type, just to say in general, encounters something like an apple, okay, they begin to build up a memory. Yes, they notice details of it and whatever, or they remember the details of it. But what they're really building up is a sense impression about the apple. So there's an aboutness and about the experience with the apple. So if it turned out that early on in life at age 2, they encountered an apple that had a horrible worm in it, that they even accidentally bit into or whatever, that creates a sense impression about apples that is eternally negative or wary in its nature. So it's true for all, SJ types, that their introverted sensing isn't just like, oh, I have a storehouse of details or whatever, that there are these sense impressions, and that for those with introverted sensing that has this more yin energy to it, it very much is this like art museum, in a sort of nice way. I mean, it could be like a pack rat's house too, as a metaphor, but this art museum of sense impressions that's very diverse and very wide about a lot of different things. So yes, they want life to be comfortable and to have positive sort of homey impressions. They're not going to run around courting like, oh yeah, I'm going to keep eating apples because that was a horrible experience. Like, no. But this is something that very much like fills the experience of the conscious experience of harmonizing and even the creative subtype. And then the extroverted feeling, this is more yin quality, is very much the accommodating host or hostess. Every guest has different needs. They're not going out and like trying to corral everybody to follow like this particular value or method or whatever. They're like, wow, like there are people coming and they all have different backgrounds and different needs, because their opposite type, their extroverted intuiting, recognizes diversity in the world. Like de facto, this is a fact of life. People are different. And especially in the particulars or the peculiar things, like so-and-so doesn't like meat, and so-and-so is actually allergic to this other thing. And this other person had a bad experience at a dinner party with this person, so I'm not going to sit them together again. So there's a lot of accommodating that happens. So this person has a lot of different sensory impressions, and they have like a tremendous capacity for accommodating. And then probably their introverted thinking is also the kind that's just like, oh, there's like so many interesting questions about life and existence and physics and the cosmos and philosophy. And they're not like, this is the only principle we're going to follow, and if you don't follow it, you're wrong. There's like, oh, like astrology, and it's been around for like thousands of years. Like, oh, I'd love to go to a lecture to hear about the history of astrology. That doesn't mean they use astrology. This is just like there's this like their opposite type, and the introverted thinking is like, that's a model, and here's another model, and here's another model, and here's a principle and another one. And so there is this like capacity to shift and to hold a lot of things at once, and it comes off being more sophisticated and certainly not bossy. And that's what allows them to then, in this conciliator mode, to sit with people or to meet with people. And yes, that could be like a counselor or a psychologist, but really it could be like there was someone in the study who's like a media interviewer. I mean, you need to know all the technical things about cameras and lighting and stuff like that. So their introverted thinking, introverted sensing are delighted by knowing these different things and learning them. And the extroverted feeling is like meeting different people, or meeting people and getting like a personal connection with them. And then the extroverted intuiting, the fourth function, is like, oh yeah, like life is so interesting, and I get to taste some of that diversity by interviewing all of these interesting people in life. And when they sit with that person, they're not like bossy and judgmental about that person. They're not trying to get them to do anything. They're just like, I'm meeting you and experiencing you in the view of the world, and bringing that to everybody else, to the community. The same, even if they're like a musician or painter, that is less about the creativity and much more about the like finding something deep within themselves. And I say, especially for something like portrait painting, which is what one of them did as like a hobby thing, and like flowers and vegetables and stuff too. But like the portrait paintings, you get to know each person. You want to see them like in the details, and like, how do you convey that? And there's so many different interesting people, and you can do it in different locations. And of course, you need to know like all of the details of the technique, brush techniques, paint color options, like lighting, like all of these things. And so for me, that's just like such a they can come off as like really rich and interesting and sophisticated. And I think this is one of the reasons why, regardless of the type we're talking about, that the harmonizing, especially the diamond, the actual de facto diamond patterns in the brain, which are like these group-like networks, tend to be more with like middle age. Like they have the sophistication that comes with them. And they even have like, because it has a wide palette of sensory impressions, it's like the fine taste, the fine preferences, which wine goes with which other wine, and appreciating that. Even if they're not the one making the decision, they appreciate when it's done right. And I find that it's so different from me. And yet there is this, when life is good, there's like such a deep appreciation for it, which is really wonderful. And if they've learned good techniques, say as a diplomat or a counselor or something like that, ideally they're an ISFJ who's learned INFJ techniques, then, because it's like a cousin, but it's more sophisticated with the intuiting, it like pushes them out of their comfort zone, that they really can, or even like INTP or ENTP techniques, then have a huge impact. And they're not just like following A, B, C kind of things. Now, before I wrap up and talk about this, though, I want to say that there's a little bit less advanced version. I want to say a little bit more immature version of this type. And actually two, because I've conveyed them as like super spiffy. As Victor Galenko, who's the one who came up with the terms and like observed this in his practice as subtypes from socionics, that all of the harmonizing folks tend to be a little bit lazy. And I think he sort of writes that out at times in an uneven way. Like his harmonizing version of ESFP is like super lazy. And compared to the dominant and normalizing and creative, they are, but they're not really lazy. They're still ESFPs. So ISFJ, when they're in the space, but they haven't found the right tools and the right job role, the right way to express it, then it can look like they just don't do very much, because they are more sophisticated and they haven't found a way to actually use it. And ISFJ is not a type that's going to be like go out and a go-getter and make that happen. The other one is very drama oriented. So what it is that the diamond patterns have not formed completely yet as like actual groups. They're more just like several regions across the brain that tend to fire one after the other. And it's sort of like, you know, when it's like conscious incompetence, like they're trying to learn these skills. And what it ends up coming off being, and I think this is mostly like adolescent 20s and maybe 30s ISFJ, and this is true for all of the FJ types, because they tend to show this zigzag pattern quite a bit. It's sort of like a zigzag is like a nascent diamond that hasn't actually formed yet. It's like the conscious incompetence. So everybody can show that to some extent, but like how long is it there? There's just like a lot of drama with it, because they're like picking from over here, and then like they're connecting things that if they were really skilled, they would know how to connect them really smartly. But they're not really skilled yet. So they're connecting them in a way that just creates confusion and unpleasantness. And they're sort of struggling with that. And they might notice that they're creating a lot of drama, which by that I specifically mean like bringing in things that people are like, how did those go together? And like, why are you bringing that up? And it could be because of something traumatic that happened to the person, as well as just like they're in the learning phase. But I do find that that's, and I don't mean that just about ISFJ, like for everybody who's been listening through the types through the series, as anybody learns to do harmonizing, they're going to go through the stage that's the conscious incompetence, and they're going to end up creating drama, whether that's like, you know, like, I don't know, with an SP type or something, like just like a psychotic break for a day. And then everybody was like, wow, okay, like maybe whatever you were smoking, you probably shouldn't smoke that anymore. Or just with NFs and NT types is just like, wow, okay, that was not you. Who was that? Like, what happened? I think that happens with all of them. but for some reason, I feel like it's in particular, I don't know why I waited until now, but we do notice this with the FJ types, because there is this space in between normalizing and harmonizing, which these are like forming. And then the question is, do they actually get the opportunity to really like take those elements and bring this into conscious competence? And they might, or they might not. And again, this is about all types that are harmonizing. But just wanted to mention, these like different ways it can show up. Because otherwise, how I describe harmonizing ISFJ is like super cool. And it can be, but just FYI.
That's interesting how all of the harmonizing subtypes can be a little bit more lazy in comparison to people of their type. Because I was wondering how that goes with being an introverted sensing dominant, because people tend to associate SI with going to a homeostasis or going into, like, they basically want to return to comfort. And so, in a way, there is that stereotype of like SJs work hard for their obligations in order to be lazy afterwards. So I wondered, because the harmonizing subtypes seems to be the leaning into that lazy part of the SI characteristics that people tend to talk about. So
And some of it is also, in all fairness, that how can I say, like, normalizing is the subtype that always looks the busiest, like has the great work ethic and endurance. Dominant takes credit for work that's done, often by organizing and managing other people. But it's clear they're out there, they're doing something, supposedly. Somebody's got to be a leader. That doesn't mean the leader does a lot of work, assembly line work, but they are working. They have responsibilities. Maybe they put in fewer hours in an obvious way, but they also supposedly should suffer more the consequences of bad choices. Supposedly, ideally. Creative can have lots of periods of being sort of lazy, but then they also have output. So people are like, oh yeah, so what were you doing the past 3 months? Like the person isn't employed or whatever. And they're like, oh, I wrote a symphony. And then people are like, I wrote a book or whatever it is. And people are like, oh, that's great. Like, okay, so you're doing something. But with harmonizing, because both of the preferred functions are in this sort of passive yin-like energy, they are contributing, but they're contributing in a way that allows for space, or they're holding space for other people. And so it seems like they're not doing anything. They are doing something, including supporting other people and allowing those other people. It's sort of like how NFs in a job environment oftentimes end up doing human resources kind of stuff, like giving people human like advice, even though that's not part of their job description. Like, oh yeah, tell me about your problems, and then they give some like a good insight, but that's not part of their job. And then people are like, well, why didn't you complete your project today? Well, I was helping so and so, but you don't want to say too much about it. And if you ask like, how did you help? It's not like you gave them money or like drove them somewhere or something. It's like, I listened. That's work too. So when I say lazy, I mention that because Victor Galenko mentions it, and it can look like that. And it can be lazy, but it can also just be called lazy by everybody else. But they are doing something.
yeah, it sounds like they spend a lot of time in an incubation period where there's something going on mulling over in their brain, but you don't see it until it actually comes out. Or if it ever does, as the yin process.
Yeah. And it could be things like, I am trying to figure out, like a parent for their child, or vice versa even, I'm trying to figure out what is the best way to approach a conversation to get them to see their own behavior so that they'll make a change. That might actually take a lot of observation and listening and thinking in order to locate that. I know for some ENFPs out there, they're like, oh, I just go talk to them and it magically happens, which might or might not. INFP is probably a little bit more like, I think it takes more work than that. But yeah, with all of the harmonizing, some things in life require patience in order to work. And even when they work, it's just part of the background. It's like we walk across the floor without thinking about the fact that the floor supports us.
Well said, well said. And so, Dario, I'd like to ask you, what are some patterns that all ISFJs share regardless of their subtype?
Hmm. I think there's a strong element, sort of narratively speaking, psychologically, thematically, of being able to name or identify what is needed and valuable. That doesn't mean that they're right all the time, because people who come out of sort of left field who are misfits, they may not know what to do with that person, or that new situation. But in general, they have a sense of, in this kind of situation or with this kind of person, this is what's needed. And the more diverse life that they have, in other words, the more that they get their like inner ENTP nurtured a little bit, probably the better they're going to be at recognizing the diversity of what people's needs are. And yet at the same time, they also have introverted thinking. So if they really get to the point of like distilling a principle of like, this is one of the core needs of human beings, to know, to feel connected, for example, as a principle. I really believe, I mean, this is a great example of TI. What is a root cause of, I don't want to say mental illness, but like emotional dissatisfaction, feeling disconnected, just feeling disconnected. And what the details vary from person to person. Feel disconnected from nature, from themselves, from their family, from their culture, from their body, from their spirituality, like whatever it is, from their life purpose. But just as a general principle, if you can help a person become reconnected with a few more things or with something, you're probably along the way going to solve whatever problem is they're complaining about on the surface. And I think that's a great example of where if an ISFJ absorbs that principle, like they're taught that and practice that, then they can be tremendously effective in what it is that they do. Whereas if they're taught another different TI model, which in practice is just not as effective, like treat everybody like, oh, everyone is a victim in some way. Like, let's identify how they've been victimized and then talk about it. No, like the research sort of suggests that doesn't work. It's like, let's identify where the person got injured and just keep picking at that injury. And so when I say like knowing what's needed and valuable, I mention all of that as sort of a metaphor that it's not just even the preferred functions, that I think TI plays a really big role. And I think that that's true for every human being. We all do TI in some way. People who learn mediocre models or even bad models, God help them, because they can cause a lot of damage in the process to themselves and others. When people learn good models, good principles, however you want to describe that, justice, truth, beauty, usefulness, relevance, then they really do identify what's needed and valuable, and that's really great. Some other things are, it's not just providing careful support, it's making the arrangements and following through with the arrangements to provide careful support. Like, what are all of those details? And having been to like conferences and talks, like people invite me, like I was just in North Carolina at the Association of Psychological Type for the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area there. Really, really great chapter, folks who know and use type. And there was really, really wonderful support and like the arrangement of that careful support. There wasn't an ISFJ. Well, actually, I think there was an ISFJ involved with that. But weirdly, it was an INTP who was older who was doing ISFJ, like consciously making an effort to do ISFJ. But this is something that comes naturally to ISFJ. I think that they do think about the future, just like ISTJ thinks about the future. It's a lie that only intuiting types think about the future. Like, that's nonsense. This is why ISTJs have like retirement accounts and pensions and the investment portfolios. And ISFJ also, they have this sense of like not just protecting the future in a practical way, like the retirement account, but how do we raise our kids in the right way that we protect them from all of the bad things that can happen in life. because bad things do happen to people. Like it happens. The kids have something to drink. They weren't supposed to. Someone was driving. They got in a car accident. Somebody got killed. Like, how do we avoid those things? And if they go back to a principle, which I feel is just in general very SJ, it's like, or SJs recognize this principle early in life, the people you surround yourself with, your friends, have a big impact on who you are. I think other temperaments, they feel like, oh no, that doesn't apply to me. SJs are like very sensitive to it. Like, who are the quality of the people you surround, the quality of the relationships? And in particular, like ISFJ, it's like, what are the qualities of the relation? Who's a bad influence? Because this is like a real thing to them. And it is. I do find they remember a lot of details. I'm so amazed with ISFJs that you can mention a conversation that happened months ago and they remember word for word what I said. I don't remember what I said 5 minutes after I say it. I'm like, well, that's amazing. You have like a tape recorder in your brain. Not that they all have this, but it seems to be a typical brain skill that their introverted sensing really and the auditory skill really tend to go together. Of course, they're very agreeable. They can be grumbly agreeable. They can be snooty agreeable. They can be delightfully agreeable. Like, there's all varieties and shades of agreeableness. Let's just make that clear, because agreeable, for those of you who read type descriptions, really wondering about ISFJs, it doesn't mean that they just nod and agree with you and do whatever you want. It comes in many, many flavors, and pay attention to those. Very sensitive to small things with strong preferences. I am amazed, and sometimes this is not always good, that I'll start a conversation with an ISFJ and realize that, like, no matter which of 5 different things I might say, they could all be interpreted in a negative way. Doesn't mean they're going to do that, but there's that moment where I'm like, oh yeah, if I'm actually sensitive, I'm going to spend the time to locate what is the thing that I can say that's supportive that cannot be interpreted in a negative way, which my brain doesn't want to do. Like, just doesn't want to do that. Because I'm used to like TJ and FP types who don't care about that kind of thing at all. Because introverted feeling looks just directly past the words and is like, no, I know what you meant by that. Like, don't worry. No, the FJ is not like that. And especially ISFJ, oh my God, so sensitive. And some of it is that inferior extroverted intuiting. What are all the possible misinterpretations or negative meanings? But it also means that when they're listeners, that they're listening really carefully to what you're saying. I think that ISFJs like to volunteer when it's appropriate. If it's not role appropriate, they're not going to do it. So let's just be really clear on that. The ISFJ who feels like, wait, you're the landlord and I'm the tenant, so why would I volunteer to pay for it? That doesn't make sense. The role appropriateness. I do think that they like a sense of accomplishment and recognition, that other people are seeing what they're doing and recognize them, and they'd love to hear when somebody praises them and lets them know this was a great job that you did. Remember to praise them and notice their accomplishments. And I think the surprise is that actually they can get incredibly technical. Some of that is just how-to technical, oh, I know how to use this machine. But a lot of it is people may be surprised, whatever their profession is, whether it's a software tool or it's an X-ray machine or a dental chair and a set of equipment, or it's Wi-Fi or it's a stereo and music. Oh my God, their level of technical knowledge is just amazing. It's where the SI and the TI come together, knowing all of those ins and outs. And I think when people ignore rules or ignore the process or the procedures, they can get very frustrated. And if they're not very mature, there's this step where even when the other person explains, this is not the way I do things, so I'm not going to do this, but I'm not trying to be difficult, that still they're grumbling like Marge Simpson, but you should follow the rules. And they just don't understand why people don't do that. I think once they learn type, then they can pop out of it. Oh, there's one more thing I want to say, and it's true for ISTJ as well. In fact, all of the SJs. There's this idea that they're very traditional and conservative and mainstream. Not necessarily. They're going to glom onto some tradition, but that might be like, what if they come from an ethnic minority? Okay, let's say their family came from China and they want to maintain their Chinese traditions. Like that isn't, is that conservative and traditional if they're living in America? Like, how do you describe that? So I think we need to be really careful about, like, traditional about what, in what way, and what are they preserving? So it's perfectly possible, for example, to be for an ISFJ, say, to be a Wicca practitioner. It involves people, and you're sitting in a circle, you get to know them, you're connecting with nature. It turns out that this is very much part of like a family tradition or like a historical tradition for them. It meets their like some like TI need or NE need, that it's like, I'm doing things in a very traditional way, but it's about something that's actually very different, NE. So it can be like a developmental kind of thing. So it's not that like every ISFJ is like, you know, neat and tidy homekeeper, although all the ones I know are. But you know, how? Like what kind of, what culture did they come from? Like culture is a big part of their experience, and they don't just randomly adopt the mainstream culture. Like they make intelligent choices just like any other adult does.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Especially because in today's culture, it's cultural to reject tradition. And
Mhm.
so for an ISFJ, right now, taking on tradition may also be ironically not taking on tradition because that's what's being taught these days. So
Yes. Yeah.
and so it's very cool how you talk about there's different kinds of agreeableness with the ISFJ. It makes me wonder if it has a little bit to do with a person's Enneagram type. Let's say, like, if an ISFJ is Enneagram 9 and also harmonizing, so they have double yin functions as their top two functions,
Mhm.
they might be that more stereotypical doormat and also very agreeable in a
Mhm.
way that they allow things to happen and they get passive aggressive about it over
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's very much so it was just in Japan for a type conference there, and type and brains and culture and cultural contrasts. And you know, at least in the Japanese group there, they described like the modal type or the ideal, not like numerically, the factually, but the ideal in Japanese culture is ISFJ. Some people will say ISTJ, having lived there myself and twice in Japan. It's somewhere between ISFJ and ISTJ. Like I completely see it, because that level of agreeableness is very important. And there's a grammar structure in Japanese called the passive suffering tense. And it's like you would say something, but in a very compact way. That's basically like the guests arrived on us, or very more simply, like I got rained on, and there's like a whole like implication that something happened and I suffered for it. And all it is it's a minor tweak to each verb, whatever verb you're using, to turn it from like regular into the passive suffering. And I feel like that's like one flavor of agreeableness. And then there can be like the hoity-toity agreeable, like, which is a sort of a confidence that comes from social class or something like that. Like that's yet again a different one. Then there's the agreeable because they actually really do care in this particular, you know, with this person in this relationship, and they're agreeing because they want to support them. So like, yeah, I'm just like all of the colors of the crayon box come into the agreeableness. And I think then that they're also confounded at times. It's like, which I understand in my own way as an INTJ. I'm just like, why do people make choices that are so ineffective? Like, why do you keep doing this public policy? Like, it doesn't work. And somebody says, like an ENTP said to me once, he's like, but how do you know that it doesn't work? I'm like, well, you set a goal, you implement a policy, you see how well the policy meets the goal. If it falls short, that was ineffective. Like, it's really as simple. Like I literally said, like that's how it works. ISFJ, in a very different way, is like, why can't people just get along? Like, why can't people be nice? And they're just sort of like confounded. Now, they also know how to be mean when they need to, but that's a conscious choice for them. And so when people don't get along, like they aren't being agreeable, especially in the shade that's expected. Like, oh, you're using red agreeableness, but shouldn't green agreeableness be the thing we use in this situation? Yes, like that's like, what shade of agreeableness are you using? And is that appropriate or not? Or like, how do I respond to that? Which is like so far away from my own experience. I only understand it through a metaphor.
That is so true. Joyce says in a very agreeable manner to, just bring it back to the subject.
Yeah, yeah.
And so thank you so much, Dario, for coming out and talking about ISFJs. If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to check out Dario's book. It'll be linked below. It's on the 64 subtypes. And thank you, Dario, for shedding your wisdom on the different kinds of agreeableness and how ISFJs can show up beyond the normalizing ISFJ.
Mhm.
And I'll see everyone in the next video. Take care.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Bye.